we're one of the best teams from our region. I'm really hopeful if we were to make it to Beijing or Shanghai.
Bueno, yo quiero demostrar que la región de Latinoamérica Sur no es tan pequeña como parece. Creo que podemos hacerle frente a cualquier rival y bueno, me gustaría demostrarlo este año.
Về mặt tâm lý cũng như là các chiến thuật để có thể đối đầu được các đội khác.
我觉得我可以表现得不错，大家也很认真，然后练到很晚。
我们队伍至少要到16强。
솔직히 위에 올라가는 거는 현실적으로 많이 힘들다 생각하고 그냥 최대한 많은 경험하고 갔으면 좋겠어요.
強い相手っていうのも分かっているので、それでも僕たちもたくさん練習してきたので、自信持って僕らの方が強いっていうのを
Hello and welcome to day 3 of the play-in stage from Wuhan, China. Groups A and B delivered on the world's hype, and we'll be looking for Groups C and D to do the same. You can see the stadium here in Wuhan. Fans, I think, are ready for another set of games. You can see the new groups taking to the stage. Players ready from young generation as well. KLG Latin gamers getting ready for their first match.
So relaxing a little bit right now, going over the game plan one last time. It looks like they don't seem too stressed for their first match of the day.
I'm excited. Group C, Group D, we're going to have a lot of new teams, new interesting play styles, going to see some conflicting stuff, and Mark C is finally going to get to experience what good League of Legends looks like.
I watch NA all the time. I don't know what you're talking about.
Oh, all right. Well, hello, everyone. I'm Daniel Dracos, joined by Mark Zimmerman. Our special guest is Andrew Vedius Day, known maybe as the host of Picks to Watch. We've been told you'll be doing all of your analysis through interpretive dance.
I shall indeed be doing all of it through
we're waiting for a sample, I think.
Yeah, I think as we move through this segment, hopefully we get to see
Once we get to some of the teams that we're talking about, I'm sure we'll find many different ways of interpreting that dance.
All right. Well, last night we locked in our first 4 teams heading to the play-in knockout stage, and now it's time to see who promotes from the remaining 6 teams. In Group C, we have Fnatic from the EULCS, Young Generation from the GPL, and LATAM South's Chaos Latin Gamers. Then in Group D, we've got Hong Kong Attitude from the LMS, the TCL's 1907 Fenerbahce, and LJL's Rampage returning to the international stage. We're going to see how things shake out with their first game at Worlds. We're going to start the day with Young Generation taking on Chaos Latin Gamers, followed by Rampage versus Hong Kong Attitude. Both groups, of course, are going to be completing their first round robin by the end of the day. Now, last night we did see clear dominance from the top teams in Group A and B, but there were actually a lot of surprises when it comes to those number 2 seeds coming through.
Right, I think when you talk about the strongest teams in each group, no surprise, the major regions dominated for the most part. Cloud9 was very aggressive. They were smashing people sub 30 minutes. That was all very impressive. On the other hand, WE took a slower approach and actually dominated through the macro game, showing that they had a better understanding of that than the emerging regions that they were playing against.
Yeah, and speaking of those emerging regions, Lion, they demonstrated they definitely know how to team fight. They were able to match in many instances some of the individual strengths that WE demonstrated, but when it came to being able to control objectives, being able to set a vision, using side lane pressure, some of that fell short and they were often punished for it. So while they demonstrated a lot of individual talent, unfortunately they couldn't quite close the gap between Team W.
But still, I think incredibly impressive when we look at the expectations laid down upon Gambit coming into the tournament. Lion were kind of under the radar, but they did come in strong, definitely smashing the games that they did play. But really the big standout to me was Team 1, who looked very weak on day 1, but then seemed to turn everything around.
I think that's the big thing for me, is just that they had such a bad day 1, and then they were down to Direwolves in their final game of the day potentially, and then out of nowhere they're able to turn that one around. Then they head into the elimination, tiebreaker match. They smashed that game, and so it was very impressive to see them kind of collect themselves over the course of the day.
Yeah, and what I loved was the fact that they finally seemed to draft the way in which they did domestically, because they were a lot on their comfort picks. Forlan finally brought out the Olaf, which he was 8-1 in during the regular
Someone didn't
season.
ban it.
Yeah, and finally gets his hand on it, and you really see the difference. So I hope that throughout the rest of the playing stages, they continue to stick to comfort. I don't want to see any more Jacks. I don't want to see any more Nidalee. Like, I have some very odd interpretive dance for those kind of champions.
Okay.
So we're going to avoid
Specifically
that as
Jack's
much as
jungle,
possibly.
correctly?
Yeah, that
Jack's
for sure.
jungle. All right, well, maybe a little questionable, but now the question is, as we move forward, is there still that kind of clear favorite looking at Group C and D? Because I think Cloud9 and World Elite, as expected, were those #1 seeds. Is it the same story for Hong Kong, Attitude, and Fnatic?
I think for Group C, at least, it's very much the same way. You can expect Fnatic to come out on top. They should be very dominant. They were a fast team domestically. That should translate pretty well, just like it did for Cloud9, because they were also one of the fastest winning teams in North America. So it'll probably be between KLG and Young Generation fighting for that second seed.
Yeah, it's certainly looking like that in Group C, whereas Group D, definitely looking a lot closer, much harder to predict who will be sitting at the top of that group. I feel like HK not coming in as the strong favorite, especially when you speak to a lot of analysts pretty much everywhere, because everyone has different opinions about who's going to.
Yeah, and especially you two. I know
Yeah, we're gonna get into it. I'm ready to prove this guy wrong.
Well, hold on, but I mean, the thing that also makes it much more complicated is, of course, there has been the emergency substitution move has been swapped out for Crash on 1907 Fenerbahce, so that also does make it a little bit more difficult to predict, because it's hard to say exactly where 1907 Fenerbahce is going to stack up against the competition.
I'm looking forward to seeing the different contrast with the two junglers, because from what I've heard, Move was much more of a slow, passive, kind of controlled early game jungler, whereas Crash, he's all about getting in your face, stealing away your camps, setting up his laners for success, and it's just two very different styles that could very much affect how well 1907 Fenerbahce perform.
I like the idea of it, because here in North America, we saw what can happen when you take an aggressive jungler and sub him in. Mike Young was someone who came out flying out of the gate, and in these best-of-1 setting, that could actually work pretty well for 1907 Fenerbahce. So we'll have to see if that actually plays out. It can also hurt the synergy, and there's a lot of
there's language barriers. Exactly. I think at the end of the day, so many question marks across the board. But looking at those three teams, I think what makes Group D so hard to predict immediately for you guys?
I think it's just because there's not such clear, obvious a powerhouse in the region, whereas like Fnatic was very strong, Cloud9 is very strong. They have these long histories of dominating their region and then moving on to, actually, all things considered, good performances on the international stage. Most of the teams here in Group D do not have much of an international history, so there's not much to see how they play outside of their own region.
Yeah, I think that's very valid. And also when you look at all the teams, it feels like that they have very clear weaknesses and very clear strengths. But each one of the teams have very different clear weaknesses and strengths. So it's very much about which team can better capitalize on their opponent's weaknesses while also making full use of their strengths.
Yeah, a lot of stylistic matches in terms of teams. But now let's take a chance to look at some individual talent from Group C and D. Best of the Rift, presented by T-Mobile, America's best unlimited network. Now, these are the 5 players that we want you to keep your eye on to steal the spotlight at Worlds. And first up, I think no surprise to many, it's 1907 Fenerbahce's Frozen.
Yeah, this guy is kind of the superstar for the team. They play around him a ton. They'll move to him, bring resources to his lane. Even when he's playing different champions, you see he was playing Lulu in this clip. Sometimes he's playing Aurelion Sol, and no matter what, it feels like the team is always collapsing to him. They play through him, and then that transitions to a strong team fight phase later on in the game.
I'm really excited to see him play and how well he will perform with his new jungler, but we've also got to look at how the jungle synergy is going to work out in Rampage with Dara, because he's been a part of the staple roster for Team Rampage, and I think that right now he's shifted his focus from being more of a roaming around dominating sort of support, but trying to set up his AD carry for success. Yutori, Moyashi, definitely one of the 2 bottom lanes that I'm really keeping my eye on.
And of course, I think no surprise to an English-speaking audience, AD carry for Fnatic has to top the charts to a certain degree. Reckless coming in as a player to watch. Marcy, you may not have
heard of this guy.
He's like the EU double lift.
Oh, they must be pretty good then, huh?
He is, in fact, pretty good. Most notably, both him and Jez down in the 2v2 lane have been dominating the majority of Europe, even challenging that of Sven and Mithy of being one of the best bottom lanes in Europe. So it's very exciting to see how well they will perform as they return to the international stage once again, but definitely a fan favorite from the side of Europe.
And speaking, of course, of AD carries, Unified coming in for Hong Kong Attitude as well. Maybe not as well known as Reckless, but definitely a guy who has been a huge playmaker for this team since they've started stepping up in the elements.
Right, I think that was one of the big things that started working out. And then once he started smashing laning phases, they could play through him. They had someone to kind of bring their jungler down to, and they can blow up leads very quickly. And then the team fight phase, he's pretty strong there as well. It does have a little bit of that craziness that can sometimes break out when you're playing Tristana, hops into dangerous situations, but for the most part, it's been working out just fine for Hong Kong Attitude.
Yeah, has been a good look overall. Last but certainly not least, jungler for Chaos Latin Gamers, Tierwolf. Now, We highlighted Sternfire previously. We like these active junglers on the world stage. We've seen how impactful they can be, and TierWolf definitely feels like no exception.
Yeah, another guy who's also very vocal as well. He's the leader for this team in the early game. They do prefer a little bit of a mid-game, late-game macro style, but they rely on his early game playmaking to get them there, buy them the space in the room to scale up. And he's someone who's very, very confident. You can hear this whole team talking about how they kind of want to be the A and X for this year's Worlds. They want to shock everyone, show that their region is legit, and bring a lot of pride to their area.
All right, well, we'll be seeing which of those players put on carry performances all week and beyond. From the first blood till the Nexus explodes, you can follow the best of Rift in more places than ever before. T-Mobile, America's best unlimited network. Now, gentlemen, as we get a little bit closer, I think it's important that we talk a little bit more about the groups and what we've seen so far in terms of the emerging Worlds meta, because it has been, I think, a little bit different than we expected. I think the big standout for me, Xayah Rakan, the first thing I want to go to, I know there's a lot of talking points. This used to be the OP duo, at least in Europe. I know it wasn't quite as focused, but why are we seeing this allowed through picks and bans so frequently?
It feels like there's still a fair amount of attention in the bot lane. Like Kalista is something that's been banned a lot. It has gotten through a couple times. Hasn't actually looked super impressive, but I feel like that's more about teams' inability to really use that champion as a team, because that's a champion that requires everyone to kind of, do a big gang up in the bot lane. You have Kalista start off with her ultimate. We just haven't seen them execute on it, but I think it's still a very strong pick, as well as there's a lot of focus still around the support position. The Rakan ban has come through a couple times. People are taking away that. Alistar, Thresh, Braum, there's a lot of stuff down there.
I think it's very much to do with, number one, the most recent nerfs that Rakan had, where now he doesn't get 100% of his bonus movement speed. When he's using his W, it's now only 30%, which means that it's a little easier to react to. But on top of that, it seems like teams have found answers in the form of things like Alistar being a really good counter pick, but also like we've seen Taric coming out from here and there, which I thought was a little bit of an odd pick, but it seems to be something that teams are just popularizing more and more down in terms of the support role. And then when you have champions like Tristana, just to add up to that, they tend to hold their own against Xayah. So it just feels like initially Xayah is a very strong AD carry that's very well rounded and can provide a lot of self-peel, but like teams are finding alternative answers to this power couple in the bottom.
It's interesting, especially in the context of these groups, because we do have a lot of strong AD carries. You look at Yutori Moyashi, you look at Unified, you look at Reckless coming into this group. It feels like hyper carries being the name of the game is so good for a lot of these teams.
I think that is very much the case. You see a lot of these crypt builds now. It's not so much just one item power spikes, though. That still kind of happens a little bit with how strong you see the, oh god, I can't remember the name of it.
Ardent Sensor?
Ardent Sensor, thank you. Yeah, that item is still very, very strong. It's kind of, you see people even taking Targons on the AD carry to get their support to that one item power spike even faster, so.
Gold runes as well,
yeah,
gold per 10 runes. It's getting a little ridiculous at this
and
point.
that feels like the other half of the support meta, right? That we have seen banned out a little bit, maybe not picked as much as we expected either, is the Jannas and the Lulus and these champions that are just going to rush Ardent Sensor every single game. I think we did have at least one game of the classic Targon's Brace, Ancient Coin bottom lane, yay for solo queue, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a little scary. There is still a fair amount of Targon's Brace on supports just in general, because a lot of these champions that do build the Ardent Sensor lack some of the explosiveness that the other melee supports bring. So you'll still see a ton of Alistar. You've seen some Braum. You'll see some Tahm Kench, different things like that.
You'll also likely see some Sivir today coming out from the side of Fnatic, a big pick that has been rising in terms of Europe, mainly as an answer to Tristana. Good scaling, teamfight AD carry that actually holds her own during the laning phase as well. So we may continue to see shifts, but for me, one of the big meta shifts has been the lack of Cassio in the current mid lane, because she did receive a very small nerf to her base damages, but because of how you usually build Cassio, mainly going for just a lot of mana and resistances in the early game, what a lot of mid lane pros seem to be identifying is you actually lose a lot of damage once you reach this mid game, because you're not building AP until later on. And the one Cassio we did see went back to the Rod of Ages build to compensate for that.
And that did feel very difficult, right? Because it feels like a small nerf, but when you think about how many Twin Fangs are cast consecutively in a lane, I think that nerf starts to stack up. But the interesting new addition to the mid lane was played by Jensen, was that Rise that Cloud9 brought out. Similar build, it was the Abyssal Mask, and I'm wondering, is this now going to be a little bit more of a staple in the mid lane in terms of kind of shakeups than what we've seen in the mid lane?
I'll need to see a little bit more of it, just because we saw it played by somebody else, it got destroyed, then Jensen plays it, smashes with it, and it felt maybe a little bit of an influence based off how good the players are. I want to see a little bit more data